Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. Always a pleasure. It's an honor and privilege to have the opportunity to interact with the viewers of Hilaal TV. Now, one of the issues closest to the hearts of many Muslims and also close to the hearts of many peace-loving people, human rights activists, people who struggle for the upliftment and the upholding of justice and fairness is the issue of Palestine. It's an issue that has been unresolved, if we can put it that way, from a Palestinian perspective in terms of what is rightfully theirs for the duration of our lifetime. Many of us, some may be on the upper end of the age scale, if we can put it that way, but this is something which is pretty much in the main kind of covered most of our lives. And many times we hear people with a great degree of sadness and with a very heavy heart expressing the sentiment and wondering very aloud that would we see the liberation of Aqsa in our lifetime. Of course, as believers, we never give up hope. As Muslims, we know that Allah works according to a different time frame, different time scale. But the Quran is very clear, very categoric, very emphatic in its promise that truth will always prevail over falsehood. At times, it would look like falsehood has the upper hand. And from our perspective as humans who live an average of 65 years, it may seem like an entire lifetime. But in terms of the scale of Allah and the system of Allah, Allah has His wisdom, Allah has His plans. But Allah tells us, قُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا يُرِيدُونَ لِيُطْفِئُوا نُورَ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ. You can try and extinguish the light of Allah. You can attempt to do that, whether it be verbally or in any other way. وَاللَّهُ مُتِمُّ نُورِهِ. Allah will complete His light. And justice is part of the light of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, irrespective who feels what or who does what or who intends what. وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهِ. Everyone can plan. The entire creation can plan. The plotters can plot, but Allah is the one with the master plan at the end of the day. Nonetheless, there are certain realities that face the Palestinian people. And as a result, our hearts ache and we feel for the Palestinians in terms of their struggle, in terms of their plight, in terms of their situation. We follow very carefully, or we should be following very carefully what happens in Palestine. At times people become more optimistic, at times people become a little despondent, but we've got to keep the conversation going. We've got to keep the conversation going. And in that light, we dedicate the program today to a discussion on Palestine. And we welcome to the program a person who's been an activist and an analyst with regards to the Palestinian issue for quite some time, and that is Zaakir Mayet. Zaakir, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Moulana. It's wonderful to be on Hilaal TV on the show with you.
Well, let me start off by asking you that when it comes to the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian cause, where did it start for you? What are your earliest memories of your own thinking with regards to Palestine, the roots and the early days of your activism, if I can put it that way?
Alhamdulillah, Moulana, I can say that I credit a lot of it to my parents. I grew up in a very political home. However, as many young people, we don't find the affinity to a Palestinian cause or to the issue of Iraq or Afghanistan. I grew up knowing war since I was a young child. The Muslim world had been obliterated. It was the Gulf War. It was then the War of Terror. And the Palestinian issue has always been part of the constant brutalities that we are forced to witness as the Ummah. And it actually changed in 2008, 2009, when I was approximately 18 years old. And for the first time, I had witnessed a live war. It wasn't something that someone had told you or something that you read in a newspaper. When you saw the visuals, you knew that people were dying at that moment in time. And like many youth, even today, you have this idea that your life is most important, your friends, your campus life, what you wear, who you're friends with, where you drive to, where you go for entertainment. And it just sparked at that moment in time that my life can't just be this. My life has to mean more than this. I shouldn't just be working, get married, have children, and that's the end of my life. I'm surely here on this earth for something greater than that. And Alhamdulillah, it started with that spark to understand that you have a role to play in the liberation of those that are oppressed. And the one thing that really touched me is that I had a aunt who had Down syndrome. And what really shook me to my core was when I read a report in 2008 during Operation Cast Lead that Israel had bombarded the home for the mentally ill and the physically disabled. And that is when I realized that we are dealing with a savage army, one that targets innocent civilians, and that I cannot sit on the sidelines. And ever since then, Alhamdulillah, it's by the will of Allah, it's not anything of our own, that we have been involved in the cause. We've been trying our very best, and we know victory all comes from Allah, but it is our obligation to make an effort.
Absolutely. So let me start with the very recent happening, and that is once again the rise to the top by Benjamin Netanyahu. What do you make of this? I mean, almost 2 decades now, he's been pretty much on the top of Israeli politics.
I'm going to borrow from the interview of Gail Talshir, where she said, and she's from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she said that this is not merely about Netanyahu rising any longer. This is more about the coalition that Netanyahu has created. And Netanyahu historically has aligned himself with more moderate elements, and by Israeli standards, moderate elements. We know that nothing has changed much in Israeli policy, even when you look at Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak, but in terms of Israeli circles, they were considered moderates. And this has been a deviation from that principle or that status quo. Now Netanyahu has aligned himself with the Zionist religious party, extreme elements within Israeli circles. Many Israelis even feel alienated by their policies, Mar Ben-Gvir and a few other extremists. And this is very dangerous. So where we find ourselves now is not a choice of Netanyahu, but more that the Israeli population who has voted has chosen the right wing, the extreme right wing. And what we are heading for, by the assessment both of Israelis, the military generals, and their own internal circles, is that we are heading for a situation where there will be a civil war, there will be ethnic conflict, there will be a fight between Israelis and Palestinians. And this is anticipated in all circles at the moment. The political decisions are catastrophic for Israel. Israel has managed the situation thus far, but we are heading for a collision course. And this is very clear from the policies and the individuals that are behind this. You just have to look at the Bezalel Smotrich, who's written that he wants to apply apartheid. It hasn't even been something that he's hidden. He's written a very, very long article about this, and he clearly states that they want to annex Palestine, give no citizenship, and wants to implement an apartheid policy, which Israel is an apartheid state, but it's becoming clearer to everyone now. Very dangerous and explosive trajectory that we are heading on right now.
Concerning indeed. What does this tell us about the electorate? We know that Netanyahu was facing charges the last time around already when he lost power to the coalition put together by Naftali Bennett. Now that they've given him the votes to be able to put together a coalition, what should we be reading into that?
Right. So Emmanuel Navnon, who is from Tel Aviv University and was formerly a lecturer at the IDC College, Herzliya, he said something very interesting. He said that what this has indicated is that not everyone in Israel has voted. A portion has voted. They said almost half has not voted. But what this does show is that even certain conservative elements are now moving towards this extremist right-wing view. And everyone is accrediting this to a moment that took place in 2021 during Saif al-Quds, when there was an explosion by the Palestinians that were within Israel proper in areas such as Lod and Akka. there was protests and they were joining the campaigns of Saif al-Quds. So the Israelis have moved to radicalism. They are moving to identity politics where they want to teach the Arabs a lesson. This is effectively what has happened. And this is what we are seeing within the vote. So you have this implementation of this extreme right-wing movement, and this will then create the products of a massive war. And there's definitely a powder keg. It's going to explode. The electorate has now moved to the extreme right wing, and we have a situation where you have a reckless state with reckless leadership, and you have a military structure that is going to be beholden to these radical elements. So I think we're going to have a real problem on our hands, and I think there will be a confrontation between the arc of resistance and the Zionist entity.
How strong or how fragile will this coalition be? We've seen this in recent years in Israeli politics. You have an election, they struggle to put together a coalition, they put it together, similar to, I suppose, in a way, what we're seeing with coalition politics in South Africa here. Then you have movement this way, that way, the entire thing collapses. Is it different this time around in terms of the numbers that Netanyahu has? Also, the charges, could that come back into play?
So it's a point that I needed to address from the previous question with regards to Netanyahu and Netanyahu's charges. Netanyahu was indicted. However, this new radical movement, the Zionist religious movement, is proposing changes to the legislation that will save Netanyahu. What they are talking about now is they are changing the legislation to destroy judicial oversight, which is a principle of most functioning governments, that when there is a problem with regards to parliamentary laws, etc., it would go to the courts. The courts would then rule on it and determine whether or not this is rational. That's the general principle, regardless of whether it's a constitution or not. Generally, they test against the constitution. However, in this new proposal, the law reform, which is being proposed by Bezalel Smotrich, it's a situation where you have to have a full bench decision. The full Supreme Court of Israel has to have the same view on a piece of legislation. That already is a problem. And even so, even if they have a certain view on a piece of legislation, the Knesset can then still overrule that with a 61% majority vote, which is a very low threshold and margin. What we have effectively is the complete destruction of the principles of rule of law. It's giving a blank check to these extremist movements. And in so doing, by tampering with the judicial system, they are protecting now Netanyahu. And also they are looking at certain pieces of legislation that will act retrospectively to protect Netanyahu from now facing these possible jail times, etc., in relation to the charges that he has been indicted for. Now, we have a situation here where I think, and it comes back to the point that I'm underscoring, is that you are going to have a reckless state. You're going to have one that is forcing this coalition to maintain its integrity. Netanyahu is completely dependent and beholden to Itmar Ben-Gvir and the other movements, and also these ultra-Orthodox who have now also joined this coalition. And he has no option but to maintain the integrity. However, because they are playing the card to save Netanyahu, Netanyahu has to do as they please. And this is what the danger is for us as those that are looking in on the Palestinian issue from the principles of justice and fairness and liberation. We see a situation where the power has been given to the far right.
What's happened to the likes of Benny Gantz and Naftali Bennett? We know not too long ago there was this, they were neck and neck, Gantz and Netanyahu. Bennett then kind of rose and caught Netanyahu by surprise. I can still picture those visuals when Netanyahu was ousted and he went and sat back in the leader's seat, and he had to be now told that, look, you're no longer the man in charge. Bennett obviously had that power sharing deal and had to step away after a period of time. But it seems like he's kind of disappeared.
So Naftali is being viewed by the Israeli public as being too soft. Yair Lapid was actually coming out as more extreme than Naftali, which is a surprise. We all know Naftali's comments. We know Naftali's positions. Naftali has been seen even by us as on the outside as extreme, and yet he was viewed as insufficient and deficient by the Israeli public. This comes down to the point of what was taking place within Israel and within the Palestinian context. And I think this is something that not Naftali can change, and this is not something that Netanyahu or his coalition with Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, no one can change the reality on the ground. The reality is that the foundational principle of Israel, the deterrence capacity, the fear of Israel has been decimated. Israel was established on the principle of fear and terror. This is acknowledged across all historians. For example, I'm just going to pull one example here, Deir Yassin, the massacres of Deir Yassin that established the state of Israel. These type of terror operations were the foundational building blocks of the state, and they continue to follow this policy. We saw the same thing with Ariel Sharon in 1967. They said that Nasser needs to be taught a lesson, the Arabs must fear them, and this continues. This policy develops even further when you look at 2006, when you had Major General Gadi Eisenkot and Giora Island, top generals within the Israeli military developing something called the Dahia principle to bomb the poorest neighborhoods within Lebanon to teach the resistance a lesson so that it comes at a cost to them to oppose Israel. Then you have the collective punishment principles, which we've been seeing consistently applied in Gaza. The siege, the inhumane siege that is illegal in terms of international law, still there. However, regardless of Israel's brutality, Israel's aggression, and disproportionate use of force, you have the rise of the resistance both in 2006, and this is the first time that Israel has faced a military defeat in a head-on fight. And ever since then, there has been a decline in Israel. So what the Israeli public is trying to do is trying to re-establish the deterrence by going more to the right. However, the failure is there because Israel, the armed forces, we're talking about the IDF, is nothing more than a glorified police force. The great scholar and analyst Munir Shafiq said something similar to us when we were at the Tawassul 2 conference in Istanbul. He said that Israel is a weak state. It is a glorified police force. It cannot fight as it fought when it established itself as a state. And now what we are having here is a complete failure of the foundational principles of Israel. They can't even contain a single armed movement in Gaza, such as Islamic Jihad, which isn't even the main movement. That gives you an indication of how weak Israel is.
We are talking to Palestinian activist and analyst Zaakir Mayet about the latest in regards to the Palestinian issue. Welcome back to the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. We continue the discussion with Zaakir Mayet in regards to Palestine. Now, Zaakir, let's move on from our discussion in the first segment of the program in relation to what was happening or what has happened in Israeli politics of late and the rise of Netanyahu and the coalition. Let's talk more about what you touched on there towards the end, and that is the state of the resistance. You've mentioned that the Israeli army is significantly weakened. What is the state of the resistance? Has it significantly improved? Is it in a better state?
I can say this with a great degree of confidence, Moulana. Alhamdulillah, we are seeing real possibilities of a victory over the Zionist entity. And this has never been seen before. What has happened and what has changed on the ground? We see constant reports within the West Bank. There's almost daily there are attacks by the resistance and resistance operations taking place against various outposts and entities that are occupying Palestine. So that's the one development within the West Bank. And you see in Gaza, we look back to 2021 with Operation Saif al-Quds, the Sword of Jerusalem, where there was an active participation of the people of Gaza and the resistance movement in defense of Bayt al-Maqdis and the surrounding areas of al-Quds. So what you have now is a resurgence of the resistance. Now, this dates back to 2021, Saif al-Quds, and Major General Yossi Kupavasa, Brigadier General Yossi Kupavasa retired. He said that there are two things that are happening within the Palestinian sphere, and he said this now in 2022. He said that there has been an increase of nationalism, but more importantly, there has been a resurgence of Islamic fervor. And this accounts for the victory that we are seeing now within the military space. In Saif al-Quds, what you had is sustained rocket fire on Israel. Israel was not able to stop the fire from Gaza. And the fire was in connection with a singular point. It was in defense of Masjid al-Aqsa. This was very clear from the Israeli sources. It's very, very clear when you look at the information that comes out of it. It's that it started on the 13th of April was Ramadan in Palestine. On the 14th, Israel had erected barricades outside Masjid al-Aqsa. And that was the catalyst. That was the spark for Saif al-Quds. You see this escalation continuing. When they did the flag march, they found it as to be a desecration of Masjid al-Aqsa. And yes, Sheikh Jarrah was an issue, was part of the issue, but the red line was the desecration and attacks against Masjid al-Aqsa. What has appeared within the Palestinian solidarity circles as well as the media is that they try to make it secular. They try to secularize the Palestinian issue and the reason for Saif al-Quds to say, no, it's only about land, it's only about Sheikh Jarrah. It had a small portion to do with that, but it was about Masjid al-Aqsa. And you see this clearly from all the statements of the resistance, that the red line is Masjid al-Aqsa. We will defend Jerusalem al-Quds. We will defend its people. But Masjid al-Aqsa is the central and key point there. So what you have now is the rewriting of the theory of the resistance. Before, we were all beholden to the issue of soft power. We were talking about boycott, divestment, and sanction. We were talking about this inclusive principles that everybody has to be part of it. It is about purely justice. It has no religious element. And what had been done is that we were doing disservice to the truth. And I have to acknowledge this as well. I advocated for that until I realized what was taking place is that they were trying to strip the nature of the conflict completely out of it. It has an Islamic element. We cannot deny its Islamic identity, and we'd be doing injustice if we were to do that and view this purely as a secular situation. Now, what has happened ever since is that the resistance has become an Islamic resistance. You have Hamas, you have Islamic Jihad, you have other factions, and you have now this grouping that has developed within the West Bank called the Lion's Den. All of these have an Islamic basis, and what Israel is saying, and this comes from Brigadier General Joseph Kupavasa, is they have no answer to the resurgence of Islamic fervor and the resurgence of the will of the Palestinians to give their lives, jihad fi sabilillah, in defense of the people, in defense of the principles of truth, justice, and liberation.
Talking about Hamas, what's the latest in terms of their strategy, their vision? We know in recent times there's been a change of leadership. Khalid Mish'al was there for a long period of time. Ismail Haniyeh, not a new face, but he's now in charge. There's been raised eyebrows in terms of them wanting to establish a relationship now with the Assad regime. Things, kind of went quiet during the COVID period as the world's attention focused on other issues. Have they kind of repositioned themselves? Are strategies changing? Is there a significant change in leadership style now under Ismail Haniyeh?
Most definitely. I think there's been a drastic change. And what has become very clear is that Hamas is acknowledging that the strength and the answer to defeating Israel is in something called the unification of the fronts. According to some Israeli analysts, they call it Dawla al-Wahda. The Hamas movement is looking at it as al-Watan al-Wahda, the one-state solution. And what we have, for the first time, we haven't seen this. In early 2022, there was a meeting with Salah al-Khururi, who's one of the Hamas representatives, Saad al-Naqala of Islamic Jihad, Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk of Hamas, and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, and this was in South Beirut. There was also a meeting with the foreign minister of Iran quietly in Beirut. There were 4 meetings in the early part of this year. And this was known to the Israeli Defense Force as well as to the Mossad, as well as Shin Bet. They could not stop these meetings. And this was an indication of the unification of the fronts. What we also saw is that in the municipal elections and the local elections within the West Bank, you had a united front between Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and other factions, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, for example, combating the Palestinian Authority, which is very clear it is an enforcer of Israel, it's a sellout, it is a collaborator. So you have this joint movement, and we saw the first indications of the joint movement coming from the Joint Operations Room in 2021, Saif al-Quds. So you have this entire strategy that has now changed. It is about creating a broad front against Israel, and the only answer is to unify across every front, which includes now Syria. You have a strong relationship in Lebanon with Hezbollah. You have a very strong relationship that is developing within Iraq and within Iran. You have the complete unification within Gaza. You have a full unification within the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority. So we have the ingredients for the first time for united action against Israel, and it has already produced the results. And I think Hamas is on the front line of this in terms of the unification principles. There's definitely a different strategy in this day and age.
Let's talk specifically about Masjid al-Aqsa and Quds. We've had periods in recent times of violence, of intrusions, of marches, of tensions. How similar or how different is the situation now at Masjid al-Aqsa specifically?
So at this moment in time, we have a massive increase in incursions by Israeli settlers protected by the armed forces of Israel as well as the police force. This has become, previously it was on and off. You would see maybe one or two incursions a week. Now it is almost on a regular basis, almost on a daily basis. What has happened is that they are trying to implement facts on the ground, as they did with the Ibrahimi Mosque, where they divided the Ibrahimi Mosque. They are asking for the same thing now with Masjid al-Aqsa. This is a red line for the resistance movement and the joint operations room of the Palestinian resistance. That is why I said, and this is the line that continues throughout, is that we are headed for a very clear confrontation. At Mer Ben-Gvir, he's the same person who has been part of these incursions into Masjid al-Aqsa. They are advocating for the same thing. They are talking about the occupation of Masjid al-Aqsa, the removal of the Palestinians, stripping them of all citizenship. This is the type of leadership that we are heading towards. In terms of Masjid al-Aqsa now, and I think this is what we have to rally around, is that Masjid al-Aqsa is the heart of the Ummah. And this is the Islamic principle. We have to recognize that it is the gateway to the heavens. This is why we have to continue our defense of Masjid al-Aqsa, and we need to support the armed resistance. The Trojan that has been built into the Palestinian issue right now is that you have to secularize your support for Palestine. And this is an injustice and is doing violence to the truth. I'm going to make a controversial statement, but it's a statement that I've made since Saif al-Quds. This is an Islamic issue. This is the reflection of the resistance, and the answer is armed resistance. We have to support armed resistance. So the way we do this is to remain firm on our belief, to remain firm on our principles. And I believe, and unfortunately, and I've been an advocate of this for many years, however, I've been exposed to certain information now, that boycott, divestment, and sanction is against armed resistance. In fact, I'll read from a small section of an official communique, which says that having BDS in your name and yet promoting messages which indirectly advocate for armed resistance and associating with groups that do, you have violated a key guideline of our movement. Meaning that you cannot be supporting the armed resistance, which is Islamic, and this is doing violence to the truth. So we have to remain firm that Masjid al-Aqsa is a red line, that we support the armed resistance as we would have supported the armed resistance in South Africa, which bore out the liberation struggle through Mkhonto weSizwe and other armed movements. Yes, boycott, sanctions, and divestment was part of it, but it was not mutually exclusive. However, the BDS movement is asking for that now, and it's asking basically to turn a back on the Islamic resistance movement, which cannot be done. And by so doing, by turning our back on the Islamic resistance movement, we are turning our back on Masjid al-Aqsa and allowing it to be occupied and divided like the Ibrahimi Mosque. The incursions are strategic. There's an internal Trojan that is working together with this principle. And I think it is very dangerous for the Muslim community to secularize the cause and to disavow and disassociate the Islamic identity from the Palestinian issue. I think that becomes a real problem. And what we will be doing is effectively handing over Masjid al-Aqsa on this principle. And we will be giving up the heart of the Ummah.
When we talk about armed resistance, many in the media get very jittery. Their understanding of armed resistance is perhaps different. They start thinking terrorism, they start thinking suicide attacks. How would you define armed resistance? I think as South Africans, it's almost expected for us to understand it better, considering our history.
Armed resistance is an international law right. And that is the irony, is that we are afraid of implementing an international law. Right? It says that an occupied people must resist an occupation by all means at their disposal, by all means necessary. So that includes armed resistance, and that is why the movement in South Africa, the armed resistance movement, Umkhonto weSizwe, is honored and venerated. This is the principle. It is not something unique and is not something to be afraid of. Israel throws the term terrorism, but Israel is a Zionist terrorist ethnocentric state that is built on the principles of terrorism. One cannot claim that an occupied people do not have a right to resist and label it terrorism when you are occupying them. If this is a principle within the law, is that you cannot claim that you are now the party that is the victim when you are the person implementing an occupation. There is no right of self-defense in an occupation. And that is the basic understanding that needs to be brought forward to all commentators, journalists, and those that are supporting on the Palestinian issue, that the right to armed resistance of the Palestinians, it is their human right, it is their international law right, and it is a right that was implemented in South Africa and should be implemented within Palestine. Further to that, what we can see is that the right to armed resistance has produced a deterrence to Israel, where Israel is now limited in their capabilities of causing death and destruction on a large scale. I'm just going to pull out one example of that. If we look at what has happened with the Karish gas field in Lebanon, it was the Hezbollah that said that we are going to attack Israel. We're going to attack the Karish gas field platform, the Energean platform, if they continue to usurp and steal from our territory the gas that they have no right to tap into. It was because of the armed resistance that Israel was forced into a position where they had to take a step back and they had to negotiate with the Lebanese government. Now, this situation gives us a very clear rubric for what needs to happen within Palestine. Israel, we have tried negotiations, you have tried passive resistance, you've tried different formats, and it is only the armed resistance that is setting an equation for Israel, and this is what we need to support. It's an international law right. There's nothing to be ashamed of.
The other issue that you raised, that of the BDS, there was a time a couple of years ago where many Palestinian activists seemed to suggest that for the immediate future, that was the route to go. Armed resistance was resulting in more casualties, more damage of infrastructure, and setting back the resistance movement simply because at the time it was perceived that Israel was so much more equipped and they out-armed the resistance. Earlier in the program, you seem to suggest that is now changing. In terms of where BDS is now, and you mentioned that they seem to be moving in the direction of saying that boycott and divestment sanctions over armed resistance. Has there been a rationale put forward for that line of argument from the side of BDS?
Well, this is their foundational principle, which many of us were not fully aware of. And what is coming out very clearly from the BNC movement is that if you support armed resistance, there's no home for you. So they are making it into a situation that it is mutually exclusive. You cannot support boycott, divestment, and sanction and armed resistance. You cannot support, for example, Hamas, who is the democratically elected representatives of the Palestinian people and their armed movement, Izzeddin al-Qassam, and support BDS at the same time. Yet they want to use the South African example and say, yes, but South Africa had a boycott, divestment, and sanction and armed resistance. They ignore that part, that these were not mutually exclusive. They worked in tandem. It was a united movement, that they had two prongs that had crushed the apartheid regime here in South Africa. The principle here is to sap the will of the people, to support the right of the Palestinians to fight on their feet and not die on their knees. They are talking about popular, unarmed resistance. Where else do we find that same rhetoric that is coming out? And that is coming out from the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, we have to be very open about it. These are collaborators. Benny Gantz had spoken to Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, to determine security cooperation. This is an indication of how corrupt the PA is. They are the ones that are promoting these principles of unarmed resistance, popular resistance. It's the same rhetoric that is coming out of the BDS movement. If we are to follow this, we would be aligning ourselves with collaborators. It is the equivalent of saying that in the South African context, we must give space, airtime, and we must support people who are spies for the security branch, who were sitting in meetings and spying on individuals that were part of the liberation movement, and that should be okay, and we must continue to act in tandem with them. That is what is being asked for by the BDS movement, to sit with our arms folded, not give the rights of international law to the Palestinians, and also to align ourselves with the same policy of the Palestinian Authority, which is clearly in collaboration. When Israel wants to kill certain activists or capture certain activists, it's the Palestinian Authority who is doing this. Now, you go even further than this when you look at certain statements of Israeli leaders and Israeli generals, where they say that Abu Mazen is not a terrorist. We cannot call him a terrorist because he is against movements like Hamas. These are clear indications that the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement is now using the playbook of the collaborators, and we cannot align with that. What it was once, the tool that was resonant with South Africa and was part of the struggle for liberation in South Africa, is no longer that. Its identity has changed, and it must be understood within the Palestinian context. It's now become just a means to appease our conscience and actually disassociate ourselves from the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that the resistance is an Islamic resistance. We must acknowledge that, number one. Number two is that this is the will of the people. You cannot impose secularism as Israel was imposed on the Palestinian people. You cannot impose that on the Palestinians. It is their choice and their right to choose which is their means of governance and what is their theory and what is their theology. You cannot impose upon them. And the final part of this is that these should not be mutually exclusive. Boycotts, divestment, and sanctions should work together with armed resistance. And this is the only way to proceed on this matter. And if they don't, then they're going to find themselves on the wayside, unfortunately, because the caravan is continuing. Justice will be achieved through the resistance. There's no other option on the table, and the results are clear for everyone to see.
We are chatting to Zaakir Mayet about the Palestinian issue, and we will continue after this break. Welcome back to the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. Our guest on the program this evening, Zaakir Mayet, Palestinian activist and analyst. We've spoken quite extensively about recent happenings and the elections, the rise of Netanyahu, the coalition, what's likely to happen, why he's got the votes, what the Israeli electorate is telling us in terms of how they're voting. We spoke about the state of the resistance. Now, in this final segment, Zaakir, how would you assess the current international support for Israel? Obviously, when we talk about support for Israel, the first point or the first place that we look at is the US. Recently, we've seen the Gulf states, we've seen Turkey kind of take a very different approach, Saudi as well, in terms of their relationship with Israel. Overall, how would you assess the state of support or, the kind of relationships that certain countries, especially Middle Eastern countries, are trying to have with Israel, considering all the dynamics?
So there are two parts to the question that requires analysis separately. The first one is the status of the relationship between the US and Israel. Just recently, based on the election results, the Biden administration has expressed extreme reservation with regards to the coalition and the inclusion of Mar Ben-Gvir and many of the other key elements within this coalition. They are extremely concerned. And therefore, they feel that it is important to distance themselves and not give an open hand as the Trump regime had done for Israel. So you see a cooling off in that sphere. The second thing is that it is a general consensus amongst generals, Major General Gilad Amos and Ephraim Sanah, all these individuals, Yossi Kupavasa, that Israel is alone. They cannot rely on America to be backing them consistently. America is now involved within the Ukrainian war, in the NATO war against Russia, and this is now sapping a lot of the support that Israel once had. So Israel views itself alone, and this comment is made in relation to the situation with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, and the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, they find themselves in a situation where they have to act on their own, and they've said it openly. They said, we find ourselves alone and we do not have the strength to deal with a nuclear Iran, because Iran is no longer a nuclear threshold state. They view it as a nuclear state, which now changes the entire dynamic in terms of a military operation and military sphere. That's the one aspect. So we're finding a cooling off of relations, especially based on the new results that have come in with the Israeli election. In relation to what has happened within the Middle East, the Middle East, the clear element is that they have normalized, they've sacrificed Palestinians, they've sacrificed their liberation, they've sacrificed their Islamic values in favor of economic benefit. This has been a very clear principle when you look at what has happened with the Abraham Accords and what they have received as compensation for giving up their values. Unfortunately, and we are seeing this from the leadership, is that unfortunately now we are seeing even in Saudi Arabia, where yes, there's been very close connections between Israel, the Mossad has worked very closely with the intelligence in Saudi, and now there's even a possibility that they will openly come out and recognize each other if the situation is right. We've seen it with Bahrain, we've seen it in many other countries, the United Arab Emirates, and this is devastating that we have gotten to a point where we are prepared to sell our values for economic benefit. However, this was also done not only for economic benefit, but to isolate Iran. They had viewed Iran as a destabilizing factor within the region because of the influence in Afghanistan, the influence in Pakistan, the influence in Iraq, the influence in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and even going down further into Yemen. Yemen, the ragtag army of Ansarullah has defeated the most well-equipped military in the Middle East. This is a concern for most of the monarchies within the Middle East, and that is why they had to put their eggs in the basket of Israel. Israel has now shown that it is also not capable of even defending themselves against the homemade rockets of Gaza. And further than that, that Gaza has now capabilities that can truly damage the state of Israel. So you have a situation where you have the Emiratis, you have the Saudis, you have many others floundering, not sure where they want to go and where their interests are held best. Further to that, you have another dynamic that is taking place within the Middle East between the Arab countries and the United States. They are pulling out their Patriot missile systems. They are now pushing it towards Europe. They are pushing it towards the Asia Pacific region. They are focusing more on a war on China. And it is a general belief that the Arab countries have now been abandoned even by the United States. Israel finds itself alone. Israel finds itself isolated. And this also can be seen from the simple fact that the electorate has put now a radical government in, a right-wing government, in the hope that that radicalism will shield themselves from the reality, the writing on the wall, that the Zionist enterprise based on colonialism, on settler colonialism, this ridiculous concept that apartheid can still exist in the world today is now coming to an end, and the state is not sustainable. And the Arabs, unfortunately, the Arab countries have now placed their eggs in the wrong basket, and they have this reality on the ground. It is unfortunate that they have sold their values in favor of economics.
Zaakir, shukran so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, accept from us, and Jazakallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa
Well,
barakatuh.
today we dedicated the program to discussing the Palestinian issue. We covered quite a bit of ground there with Palestinian analyst and activist Zaakir Mayet. Let me conclude by saying this. On the one hand, we shouldn't underestimate the power of dua. We know before the first battle in Islam on the night prior to Badr, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam spent the entire night in dua and supplication. And we saw then the acceptance of his supplication the next day in that very great and definitive victory. On the other hand, we don't only suffice on dua. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam applied strategy at Badr. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam made an effort, even though the Muslims were outnumbered and they were ill-equipped. So the activism needs to continue. We should make dua. The activism needs to continue. There needs to be a pain in our hearts because the Muslim Ummah is like one body. If any part of the Ummah anywhere in the world is in difficulty, then we all should be restless. And this is not just any part anywhere in the world. This is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa Al-Mubarak. The third thing is education. You know, many of us speak from an emotional perspective. We understand the virtue of the place. But do we know about the issues? Do we have the facts? Education is power. So don't just pass on the zeal to your children and grandchildren, but also pass on to them education with regards to the Palestinian issue. They must be able to articulate the viewpoint in a way that is convincing. They must understand it in all of its nuances and all of its dynamics because there's so much of propaganda around the Palestinian issue in the world today. That's it from the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show for this week. Until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.